At midnight, inside Julian Vance's penthouse, the security alarm suddenly went silent. Then Ellie's bedroom door handle began to turn. Clara Miller shot up from the chair, her bruised face pale, her bandaged hands trembling as she stepped in front of the sleeping child. "Who's there?" she whispered. A sharp click answered her. The door exploded inward. Smoke swallowed the room. Ellie screamed. Armed men rushed through the haze, and then Julian Vance appeared, gun raised, his eyes wide with horror. "Clara, get down." Before she could move, gunfire tore through the smoke. Julian threw himself in front of her and took the bullets meant for the maid and the little girl. As he collapsed, Dante stepped from the darkness with a cold smile. "Business," he said, grabbing Ellie. "Crowley pays well for loose ends." Clara stared at Julian bleeding on the floor, then at the rooftop above, where a helicopter was already starting. And this is where our story begins. Stay with me until the end and don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would do if you were Clara. The Vance mansion did not creak, it did not breathe, it simply existed, cold and polished, like a museum no one was allowed to enjoy. Marble floors, white walls, silence so complete you could hear your own pulse in your ears. Julian Vance liked it that way. He sat at the head of a long dining table built for 20, eating a meal meant for one, when he heard it. A scrape, slow, dragging, right foot, then a pause. Then the left. He did not look up. He did not need to. He already knew the sound belonged to her. Clara Miller moved like the world owed her an apology it would never give. Heavy frame, tired eyes. A limp that pulled her right leg behind her like dead weight. The other staff called her clumsy behind cupped hands and sometimes not behind anything at all. That night, she carried a tray of crystal glasses through the dining hall. Julian watched her knuckles whiten around the silver handles, watched her hands begin to shake, just slightly, the way a leaf shakes before it falls. Then it fell. The glasses hit the marble and exploded into 100 small suns, each one catching the chandelier light before scattering across the floor. Laughter came first, sharp and ugly, from the two younger maids by the kitchen door. Clara said nothing. She lowered herself, slow and careful, knees cracking against the hard floor, and began collecting the shards one by one. A piece sliced her palm. Red bloomed against the white marble. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She just kept picking up the glass. Like pain was something she had already made peace with a long time ago. Julian watched from the balcony above, half hidden in shadow, the way a man watches something he doesn't yet understand. He had seen men take bullets and scream. He had seen grown enforcers cry over a broken finger. And here was this maid, bleeding quietly on his floor, not making a sound. That was the part that stayed with him. Later, alone in his study, he pulled up the security feed. Months of footage, condensed and replayed. He watched Clara move through his house like a ghost, slow, methodical, always exhausted, always limping, and yet always there before sunrise and gone long after the rest of the staff had clocked out. He noticed things he hadn't bothered to notice before. The way she lingered near the medical supply closet, longer than her duties required. The way certain items kept vanishing in small amounts. Gauze, antiseptic, protein shakes meant for his private gym, the kind built for muscle recovery, not for a woman who barely ate at his table. He frowned and rewound the footage. Watched it again. Theft, plain and simple. That was what Dante would call it. When Julian brought him into the study the next morning, "She's stealing from you," Dante said, arms crossed. Expression flat with the particular disdain he reserved for people he considered beneath him. "Medical supplies. Food, it's been going on for weeks. Let me handle it. We'll have someone new by Friday." Julian said nothing for a long moment. He watched the paused frame on the screen. Clara, frozen mid, one hand braced against the wall like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "No," he said finally. Dante blinked. "No, leave her." "Julian, she's stealing. From you, that's not a small thing." "I said leave her." Dante studied his boss the way a man studies a problem he can't solve, then nodded once and left without another word. He didn't understand. Julian wasn't sure he understood either. He only knew that something about the way Clara moved through pain, silent and unflinching, had lodged itself somewhere in his chest and refused to let go. That evening, he found a reason to be near the staff entrance when the shift changed. He told himself it was nothing, just a man checking on his property, making sure the locks were secure. He told himself a lot of things that turned out to be lies. Clara came down the back hallway, coat buttoned to her throat despite the warmth of the house, bag slung heavy over one shoulder. She moved past him without a glance, the way the staff always did, trained not to make eye contact with the man who owned the roof over their heads. But as she reached for the door, the collar of her coat shifted, just for a second. Just enough. Julian saw it. Deep purple and shaped unmistakably like a hand, wrapped around the side of her neck. Fresh. Days old at most. She caught him looking and yanked the collar back into place. Quick and practiced. Like she'd done it 100 times before. No explanation. No excuse. Just a tired, guarded look that told him this was not new. Then she was gone. Out into the dark. The door clicking shut behind her. Julian stood there a long while, staring at nothing. He had built an empire on knowing things before other people did. Who was lying? Who was scared? Who could be trusted, and who would put a knife in his back the moment he turned around? It was instinct, sharpened over years of blood and betrayal. And every instinct he had was screaming that something was very wrong in the life of the clumsy maid, who never once asked him for help. He thought of the bruise, the stolen gauze, the protein shakes meant to rebuild damaged muscle, the limp that worsened some days and eased on others, like an old injury fighting to heal and losing. Whatever Clara Miller was hiding, it was bigger than a few missing supplies. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Julian Vance found himself wanting to know the truth, not because it threatened him, but because some quiet, unfamiliar part of him needed her to be safe. He didn't understand it yet. But he would follow her into the dark to find out. The rain came down in sheets, the kind that turned streetlights into smeared halos and swallowed sound whole. Julian Vance stood across the street from his own mansion, collar up, hands buried in the pockets of a coat that cost more than most people's cars, and watched Clara Miller walk into the storm like she'd done it every night of her life. She didn't look back. She never did. He followed at a distance, the way he'd once tracked men he intended to kill, patient, silent, letting the rain cover his footsteps. Clara moved slower than most, her bad leg dragging just enough to throw off her rhythm. But there was a strange efficiency to it. She knew this city. She knew its shortcuts, its blind corners, the gaps between buildings where a person could disappear if they needed to. She took the subway first, riding 3 stops before getting off, only to cross the platform and board a train going the opposite direction. Julian almost lost her there. He caught the closing doors with his shoulder, slipped through, and found a seat at the far end of the car, hat low, eyes down. Clara didn't notice him, or if she did, she gave no sign of it. She got off 2 stops later, climbed the stairs into the rain again, and cut through an alley that smelled of garbage and wet concrete. Julian followed, staying 20 feet back, close enough to keep her in sight, far enough that his presence wouldn't register as a threat. She stopped at the mouth of a second alley, this one darker, narrower, walled in by brick on both sides. She leaned against the wet brick and closed her eyes, just for a second, just long enough to breathe. Julian watched her shoulders drop, watched the tension bleed out of her like water running off a roof. She thought she'd lost whoever might be following. She thought, for one brief moment, that she was safe. She was wrong. The scrape of boots on wet pavement came from behind her, slow and deliberate. The sound of men who weren't in a hurry because they already knew they'd won. Julian froze in the shadow of a doorway, watching 3 figures emerge from the dark end of the alley, blocking the only way out. "Evening, sweetheart," one of them said, tall, broad-shouldered, a scar running from his ear to his jaw. "Long way from home." Clara straightened, but she didn't run. Running wasn't an option. Not with that leg. Not in this rain. She knew it. They knew it too. "I don't have anything you want," she said. Her voice was steady, but Julian could hear the tremor underneath it. The kind that comes from years of practicing calm in the middle of fear. Funny, the scarred man said, stepping closer. Boss seems to think you do. Says you've been real busy lately, real careful. People don't get that careful unless they're hiding something good. The other two men spread out, cutting off any angle of escape. Clara's eyes flicked left, then right. Calculating. The way someone does when they've run out of options and are simply trying to decide which kind of pain is coming next. I work for the Vance family, she said. You touch me. You'll have more trouble than you can handle. The scarred man laughed, low and ugly. The Vance family doesn't even know your name, sweetheart. You're a maid. You clean toilets. Nobody's coming to save you. He was wrong about that too, though none of them knew it yet. He grabbed her by the front of her coat and shoved her hard against the brick wall. Her bag hit the ground, spilling its contents across the wet pavement. Gauze, antiseptic, a small bottle of children's fever medicine. The things she'd been quietly stealing from Julian's house for months, scattered now in the rain like evidence at a crime scene. What's all this? One of the other men asked, crouching to pick through the bag. Looks like somebody's playing nurse. Clara lunged for the bag, desperate in a way she hadn't been desperate for herself, and the scarred man shoved her down. She hit the wet concrete hard, her bad leg buckling beneath her, and a sound tore out of her that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sob. They stomped on the bag, crushed the bottle of medicine under a boot heel, the liquid running pink and useless into the gutter. Clara didn't try to fight back. She didn't try to protect herself at all. She crawled toward the broken bottle, hands shaking, and the sound she made wasn't pain. It was grief. That was for a kid, she said, voice cracking. That was for a sick kid, you son of a. The scarred man raised his boot again, aiming for her ribs this time. And that was the moment Julian Vance stepped out of the shadows. He didn't shout. He didn't announce himself. He simply raised the gun he'd been carrying since he was 19 years old and fired 3 times, fast and precise. The sound swallowed almost entirely by the rain. 3 bodies hit the ground. 3 lives ended in less time than it takes to draw a breath. Clara stared up at him from the wet pavement, soaked through, bleeding from a cut above her eyebrow. And for the first time since he'd started watching her, she looked at him directly. Not the careful, downcast glance of a maid avoiding her employer's eyes. A real look. Unflinching, furious. Who are you working for? Julian said. It wasn't really a question. What are you hiding? Clara pushed herself up against the wall, ignoring his offered hand, and got to her feet on her own, swaying slightly before she found her balance. You think a gun makes you a man, Mr. Vance, she said, and her voice was steadier now, sharpened by something that had been building in her for a long time. You think because you can kill 3 men in the rain, that makes you powerful. Julian said nothing. He'd never been spoken to this way by anyone who still had a pulse afterward. The measure of a human life, Clara continued, is how you treat the people who can give you nothing. Not the people who fear you. Not the people who owe you money or loyalty or blood. The maid who scrubs your floors. The kid you'll never meet. The people who have nothing to offer you and everything to lose. That's the measure, Mr. Vance. And you have money. You have power. But you have absolutely no humanity left. She bent down, slow and pained, and began gathering what was left of her supplies. The crushed gauze, the shattered glass from the medicine bottle. Her hands shook the entire time, but she didn't stop. I don't need your help, she said, not looking at him. I never asked for it. You're bleeding. I've bled before. She slung the ruined bag over her shoulder and started limping toward the far end of the alley, toward a row of tenement buildings that looked one hard winter away from collapsing entirely. Julian followed, and this time he made no effort to hide it. I'm not leaving, he said. Then you're wasting your time, Clara. She stopped at the sound of her own name in his mouth, like she hadn't expected him to know it, or hadn't expected him to use it like it meant something. Whatever this is, Julian said. Whatever you're protecting. I can help. I have resources you can't imagine, money, men, things that could make whatever you're running from disappear. Clara turned to face him fully, rain running down her face, mixing with something that might have been tears or might have just been the storm. You don't understand what you're offering. she said quietly. And you don't understand what it would cost. She turned and walked into the tenement building without another word, leaving him standing in the rain with 3 dead men behind him and 1,000 questions he hadn't even known to ask an hour ago. He followed her inside anyway. The building's lobby was dark, the bulbs long since burned out and never replaced. Clara moved through it like she knew every loose floorboard, every place the shadows ran deep enough to hide in. She led him down a narrow staircase, deeper into the building, past doors with heaping paint and the smell of mildew thick in the air. At the bottom of the stairs was a door, heavier than the others, reinforced with a steel bar across the frame. Clara knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more. A code, a pattern someone on the other side would recognize. "Stay back," she said to Julian, not turning around, "and put your gun away." Now, he didn't listen. Some habits run deeper than instruction. He drew his weapon and held it low, ready, as the door creaked open from the inside. What greeted him was the unmistakable sound of a shotgun racking in the dark, the kind of sound that meant whoever stood behind that door had already decided he was a threat worth killing. The boiler room was a tomb of rust and shadow, lit only by a single bare bulb swinging from a frayed cord overhead. The air smelled of mold and old copper pipe. Somewhere, water dripped steadily into a puddle that had clearly been forming for years. Julian raised his weapon as the shotgun's barrel emerged from the darkness, level with his chest. A man stepped forward into the dim light, tall, scarred down one side of his face, eyes hard with the particular wariness of someone who'd spent years waiting for the worst to happen. "Marcus, no," Clara said, stepping between them, her hands raised. "He's not a threat. He's the one who saved me." Marcus Thorne didn't lower the shotgun. His gaze flicked from Clara's bleeding eyebrow to Julian's gun to the dried blood already drying brown against Julian's knuckles. "You brought him here," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "I didn't bring him. He followed me." Clara's voice cracked, exhaustion finally breaking through the careful composure she'd held in the alley. "They found me. Marcus, 3 of Crowley's men. They're dead now. But they found me, which means they know I'm in the city. Which means it's only a matter of time before they find this place too." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, fear bleeding through the hardness. He lowered the shotgun an inch, then stopped, then raised it again, torn between instinct and information he didn't yet have. That was when Julian saw her, a small shape pressed against the far wall, half hidden behind a stack of old crates, green eyes wide and unblinking in the gloom. A little girl, no older than 4, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest with both arms. The world tilted beneath Julian's feet. "Ellie," he said, and his voice came out broken, barely a whisper. The girl flinched at her own name, pressing further back into the shadows. Clara moved instantly, putting her body between Julian and the child, the same way she would have stepped between Ellie and a falling beam, a speeding car, anything at all. "Don't," Clara said, sharp now. "Don't you dare scare her. That's my niece." Julian's hands were shaking, the gun lowering on its own. "Forgotten. She died. They told me she died. The car bomb. 18 months ago. There was nothing left. There was no body to bury because there was nothing left. There was a body," Marcus said, lowering the shotgun fully now, his voice rough with old grief. "Just not hers. I pulled her out of that wreckage with my bare hands, burned half my arm doing it. Crowley's men set that bomb thinking they'd kill the whole Vance bloodline in one shot. They almost did." Julian looked at Clara. An understanding moved through him, slow and devastating, like a wave finally reaching shore after traveling a great distance. "Your leg," he said. "Your hands." The shaking. Clara's jaw tightened. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she crossed the small room and knelt in front of Ellie, her movements gentle despite the obvious pain it cost her, and murmured something too quiet for Julian to hear. The girl's grip on the stuffed rabbit loosened slightly. She didn't smile, but she stopped trembling. "I was a trauma nurse," Clara said finally, still facing the child, not looking at Julian. "Before all this. I was 3 blocks from where that car went off when it happened. I heard the blast. I ran toward it instead of away, because that's what I was trained to do." She reached up and touched her own throat. where a thin scar ran just beneath her jaw. One Julian hadn't noticed until now. Marcus had her out of the wreckage, but there was a second device, a secondary charge. The kind people use to kill the first responders who come running to help. I saw it. I had maybe a second and a half to do something about it. You threw yourself over her, Julian said. I threw my whole body over both of them. The blast wave caught me anyway. Nerve damage. Mostly down my right side. Spine, hip, hands. Doctor said I was lucky to walk again at all. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes hard and bright in the dim light. I lost my nursing license 6 months later. Insurance fraud, they called it. Because I'd been pulling supplies and medication from 3 different hospitals to keep her alive and hidden. I'd lost my apartment not long after that. Lost everything I had, actually piece by piece, until all that was left was this. She gestured around the boiler room, the crates, the single mattress in the corner, the small collection of children's books stacked neatly beside it despite everything else falling apart. I took a job in your house because it paid in cash and asked no questions, she said. I stole from you because I had nothing left to steal from, and every single night. I came down here to make sure she was still breathing. Julian sank slowly onto an overturned crate, his legs no longer entirely willing to hold him. He looked at Ellie, who had crept closer to Clara now, one small hand fisted in the fabric of Clara's coat. His brother's daughter, alive, hidden in a basement for 18 months by a woman he'd let his own staff mock and threaten to fire. A woman who had given up everything she had and would ever have to keep one little girl breathing. I should have known, he said, more to himself than to anyone in the room. I should have looked harder. I told myself she was dead because it was easier than searching. Because Crowley's people told me she was dead, and I believed them because grieving was simpler than hoping. You're here now, Clara said. I let her live in a basement. I let her live in fear. In the dark. While I sat in a mansion with 20 empty rooms, Julian. Clara's voice cut through his spiral, firm in a way that surprised him. Stop. He looked up at her. Guilt doesn't fix anything, she said. It just sits there and rots. And it doesn't protect her. And it doesn't protect anyone. You want to make this right, then make it right starting now. Not by drowning in what you didn't do. Julian's hand drifted, almost without his permission, toward the gun still resting loosely in his grip, as if some part of him needed to hold a weapon to feel like he was doing something useful. Clara reached out and gently pushed the barrel down, away from anyone, away from anything. Healing doesn't start with a bullet, Julian, she said quietly. It starts with protecting what's left. Every human being deserves a life built on love, not blood, not revenge. Not whatever you've spent your whole life believing power was supposed to mean. The bare bulb overhead flickered once, then steadied. Julian looked at Ellie again. She was watching him now, curious rather than afraid, the way only a small child could recover so quickly from terror. I'm your uncle, he said softly, kneeling slowly so he wasn't towering over her. I knew your daddy. I loved him very much. Ellie's grip on the stuffed rabbit loosened a fraction more. Clara says you have a big house, she said, her small voice barely above a whisper. I do. Does it have a yard? Something cracked open in Julian's chest. Something that had been sealed shut for years, maybe decades. It does. It's not much of one, but we could fix that. For the first time since he'd entered the room, Marcus lowered the shotgun completely, setting it against the wall with the careful reverence of a man finally allowed to rest. I'll protect them with my life, Zwinsian said, looking between Clara and Marcus. Swear it, whatever it costs me, whatever I have to give up. Clara studied him for a long moment, searching his face for whatever truth she needed to find there. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy something in her, because the tension in her shoulders eased, just slightly. For the first time since Julian had started following her through the rain. All right, she said, then we move her tonight, somewhere safer than this. The warmth of the moment lasted exactly as long as it took for the small, high window near the ceiling to shatter inward, glass raining down across the concrete floor in a shower of glittering shards. A bottle followed it, trailing fire, the rag stuffed in its neck already burning bright orange. It hit the mattress in the corner and erupted into flame. The fire moved faster than anything had a right to move. It caught the mattress first, then the stack of children's books beside it, then crawled hungrily up the wooden support beam toward the ceiling, the old dry wood of the building offering no resistance at all. Smoke filled the room in seconds, thick and black, stinging eyes and clawing at throats. They tracked the blood. Marcus shouted over the roar, already moving, scooping his shotgun off the wall and pressing his back against the doorframe. Your blood. On the alley wall. It must have led them straight here. Gunfire erupted from above, automatic and relentless, chewing through what remained of the small window and forcing everyone flat against the floor. Dust and plaster rained down with each impact. Clara's voice cracked through the chaos, raw with terror. She lunged across the burning room, throwing her entire weight over the child just as a support beam, weakened by the spreading flame, cracked and fell from above. It struck Clara across the back and shoulder, and she let out a sound of pure agony. But she did not move, did not let the beam's full weight reach the small body curled beneath her. Get her out, Marcus roared, firing blind into the stairwell above, holding the choke point with everything he had left. Julian, get them out. Now I'll hold them as long as I can. Julian dragged the smoldering beam off Clara's back, his hands burning against the hot wood, and hauled her upright. She staggered, favoring her already damaged leg even more now. But she kept moving, kept her arms wrapped tight around Ellie even as smoke poured into the girl's small lungs and she began to cough and cry. There, Clara gasped, pointing through the haze toward a rusted metal hatch set low in the far wall, half hidden behind a collapsed shelving unit. Old coal chute. It runs to the storm drains under the street. Julian shoved the shelving unit aside, ignoring the bite of rusted metal against his palms, and wrenched the hatch open. Cold, damp air rushed up from below. A small mercy is against the heat now radiating through the entire room. Marcus, Julian shouted. Now, we go now. I'm right behind you, Marcus called back, but his voice was strained, and the gunfire above had grown closer, more concentrated. The sound of men descending the stairs despite everything he was throwing at them. Clara hesitated at the mouth of the chute, looking back at Marcus's silhouette in the firelight, his shoulders set, his stance unwavering even as the flames climbed higher around him. Marcus, come on, go, he bellowed, not turning around. Get her out of here. I'll catch up. There was no time to argue. Julian lowered Ellie into the chute first, sliding her gently into the dark, then helped Clara follow, her injured body moving slower than the moment allowed. He dropped in last, the metal scraping against his back, the heat and noise of the burning room vanishing behind him into sudden, suffocating darkness. They fell, slid and landed hard in ankle-deep water, the cold shock of it driving the breath from all three of them at once. Above them, muffled through layers of concrete and earth, came the unmistakable groan of a building beginning to fail. Then the explosion. Not from a weapon, from the fire itself, finding the boiler room's old gas line, the sound and force of it shaking dust loose from the tunnel ceiling above their heads. The ground itself seemed to shudder. Marcus, Clara screamed, twisting back toward the chute. But there was nothing there now except smoke pouring down into the tunnel and the distant, terrible sound of a structure collapsing in on itself. No, she whispered. No, 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 Julian grabbed her, pulling her back from the chute's opening as more debris rained down. Clara, we have to move. The whole tunnel could come down. He's still in there. Clara, but she had already gone still in his arms, her whole body rigid, listening. And then it came, faint and far away but unmistakable, carried down through the chute on a wave of heat and smoke, a scream. Marcus's voice, raw and final, cut short by a second. Smaller explosion that finished what the fire had started. Clara made a sound unlike anything Julian had ever heard a person make. Not a scream, something quieter and somehow worse. A kind of grief that came from somewhere too deep to voice properly. Ellie began to cry, the sound small and lost in the vast dark of the storm drain, and Clara's training, or maybe just pure instinct, pulled her back from the edge of her own collapse. She wrapped both arms around the girl, pressing her face into damp curls. Holding on like Ellie was the only solid thing left in a world that kept falling apart. He's gone, she said, voice hollow. He pulled her out of a bombed car with his bare hands and hid her for 18 months and he's gone. Just like that. And I never even told him. Clara, Julian crouched beside her in the freezing water, his own voice unsteady. We have to keep moving. For her, we can grieve him properly once she's safe. I promise you that. But not here. Not now, Clara closed her eyes, the water rising past her ankles as it pooled deeper in the tunnel, and nodded once, jerky and small. They moved through the storm drains in silence after that, following the slow downward slope of the tunnel toward wherever it emptied out. Julian leading with one arm braced against the slick concrete wall, Clara behind him carrying Ellie despite her own ruined leg, refusing every offer to hand the girl over. I've got her, she said each time, voice flat with exhaustion and grief. I've had her for 18 months. I'm not putting her down now. They emerged nearly an hour later through a drainage grate near the harbor, soaked, freezing, and coated in soot and tunnel grime. Julian's phone, somehow still functioning, brought his armored convoy within 15 minutes. Headlights cutting through the rain like twin blades. Dante stepped out to open the rear door himself, his expression carefully arranged into something like relief. Thank God, Dante said, ushering them toward the warmth of the vehicle's interior. We were starting to think the worst. Come on, let's get you all somewhere safe. Julian exhausted beyond measure. Grief still raw from Marcus's death and the unbearable weight of everything Clara had sacrificed. Didn't notice the way Dante's eyes lingered a half second too long on Ellie. Didn't notice the small, calculating stillness behind his underboss's carefully composed face as he watched the child climb into the car. Clara settled into the seat with Ellie curled against her side, both of them shivering, both of them alive. The convoy pulled away from the curb and into the rain-soaked dark, leaving the ruins of the boiler room and Marcus Thorne's final stand behind them. In the rearview mirror, just for a moment, Julian caught Dante's reflection. He thought nothing of it. He should have. The penthouse rose 40 stories above the city, a fortress of glass and steel that Julian had built years ago and rarely used. Back when he believed safety could be bought outright and stored away like cash in a vault. Tonight, he was grateful for every dollar it had cost. The elevator opened directly into a private foyer, biometric locks sealing behind them with a soft, expensive click. Inside, the air was warm and clean, a sharp contrast to the cold and smoke they'd left behind in the storm drains. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the harbor, the city lights blurred and soft through the rain. Clara stood just past the threshold, dripping onto marble that probably cost more than the entire tenement building she'd called home for the past year and a half, and didn't move. You're safe here, Julian said, watching her take it all in. Reinforced walls, private security on every floor. Nobody gets up here who isn't supposed to. Marcus thought the same thing about a basement, Clara said quietly. There was nothing Julian could say to that. He simply nodded and gestured toward the hallway. There are rooms. Clean clothes. A doctor is already on the way for that leg. And for your hands. I don't need a doctor. Clara, she looked at him, exhausted past the point of arguing. Ellie still asleep against her shoulder despite the chaos of the last several hours. The particular boneless sleep of a child who had simply run out of fear to feel. Fine, she said. For her, not for me. He let it go. There would be time later to insist. A member of his household staff appeared, quiet and efficient, and guided Clara toward a guest suite at the end of the hall. One of the few rooms in the penthouse that had ever been furnished with any warmth at all. Julian had built this place for emergencies, not for living, and it showed in every sterile, untouched corner. 2 hours later, bathed and bandaged, Ellie was finally asleep in a bed 3 times too large for her, tucked beneath blankets soft enough that she'd stopped whimpering in her sleep almost immediately. Clara sat in the chair beside the bed, her own hands wrapped in clean gauze, her bad leg propped on a low ottoman. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let her shoulders drop. She believed, for a few precious hours, that the worst was over. She believed wrong, but she didn't know that yet, and so she let herself rest. Down the hall, in the penthouse's private study, Dante stood near the window with a drink in hand, watching the rain streak down the glass. Julian entered without knocking, exhaustion etched into every line of his face, and poured himself a drink he didn't really want. You did good work tonight, Julian said, getting the convoy there so fast. It's my job. Dante said smoothly. Speaking of which, we should talk about the maid. Julian's jaw tightened. Her name is Clara. Clara, then. Dante's tone was careful. Measured the tone of a man choosing his words with precision. I understand the sentiment. Julian, truly I do. She protected Ellie. That matters. But she's still staff. She doesn't belong in the family wing. She doesn't belong making decisions about security, about the child's care, about any of this. She kept Ellie alive for 18 months with nothing, Julian said. No resources. No protection. Just her own body between that girl and every threat that came for her. I don't think you understand what that cost her. I understand it was admirable, Dante said. I also understand that admiration and authority are different things. She's not family, Julian. She's not syndicate. She's a maid with a damaged leg and a stolen nursing license. And the men downstairs are already whispering about how a woman like that ended up sleeping under your roof like she belongs there. Something cold moved through Julian's chest. Say what you actually mean. Dante set his glass down, his expression finally slipping, just slightly, into something closer to contempt. I mean, it looks weak. It looks like the head of the Vance syndicate has gone soft over a crippled servant who can't even hold a tray without dropping it. The other families are watching. Julian, Crowley already came at her twice. If word gets out that she's living here, treated like she's one of us, it invites more of the same. It invites disrespect. Disrespect. Julian repeated, yes. Julian set his own glass down, untouched, and walked out of the study without another word. Dante watched him go, jaw tight, already calculating his next move. The first quiet thread of betrayal already spinning itself loose in the dark of his own ambition. The next morning, Julian found Clara in the penthouse kitchen, attempting one-handed to make tea despite the bandages still wrapped thick around both palms. He watched from the doorway for a moment before stepping in to take the kettle from her. Let me, I can manage. I know you can. Let me anyway. She allowed it, settling onto a stool at the counter, watching him move through an unfamiliar kitchen with the same careful attention she gave everything else. Ellie was still asleep down the hall, exhausted from the night before, and the penthouse around them was quiet in a way that almost felt peaceful. It didn't last. Dante walked in without knocking, two of his men trailing behind him, and stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes moving over Clara with open disdain. She still wore the borrowed robe from the night before, her hair unwashed, the bandages on her hands stark white against her skin. Every visible mark of the violence she'd survived on full display. Quite the house guest, Dante said, not bothering to lower his voice. I didn't realize we'd started letting the help eat breakfast at the family table. Clara's spine straightened, but she said nothing. The old, practiced silence of someone who had learned a long time ago that defending herself rarely changed anything. Julian set the kettle down with deliberate care. Dante, I'm only saying what everyone's thinking. Dante continued, undeterred, gesturing toward Clara with a casual, cutting motion. Look at her, scarred, limping. Can't even hold a teacup without those hands shaking. It's not exactly the image of the syndicate I think we want to project. The room went very quiet. Julian set down the towel he'd been holding, walked around the counter, and approached Clara's chair. He didn't say anything at first. He simply knelt, slowly, deliberately, lowering himself in front of her like a man approaching something sacred, and reached into his pocket for the silk handkerchief he always carried, the one monogrammed with the Vance family crest. He took her bandaged hand in his, gentle as anything, and used the handkerchief to wipe away a smear of soot, still clinging to her wrist from the night before. Soot the bath hadn't quite managed to remove. Dante's two men exchanged an uneasy glance. Dante himself fell silent, watching his expression flickering between confusion and something darker underneath. Equality is not a concept we ignore for convenience, Dante, Julian said, his voice quiet but carrying easily through the still room. He did not look up from Clara's hand as he spoke. I built this organization on the belief that strength protects the vulnerable. Somewhere along the way, I let that belief get buried under money and fear, and the easy comfort of looking down on people instead of standing beside them. He finished cleaning her wrist and folded the handkerchief carefully, setting it aside. Her scars are worth more than your life, he said, finally looking up, his eyes meeting Dante's directly. She held pressure on a wound with broken hands. She gave up a career, a home, every comfort she'd ever had, to keep a 4-year-old girl breathing in a basement for 18 months, asking for nothing in return. Respect is a fundamental right, Dante. Not a privilege I hand out to people who've earned my approval. In this house, she outranks you. The silence that followed was absolute. Dante's jaw worked, color rising in his face. Humiliation and fury tangled together behind eyes that had gone flat and hard. Of course, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. My apologies. I spoke out of turn. He left the kitchen without another word, his men trailing behind him. But the look he cast back over his shoulder, just before the door swung shut, was not one of apology. It was the look of a man who had just decided something. Clara watched the door close, then looked down at Julian, still kneeling in front of her, his hand still resting lightly over hers. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Yes, Julian said. I did. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the calculation, the angle, the thing men like him usually wanted in return for kindness. She didn't find it. What she found instead was something closer to shame, an old debt he was just beginning to understand he owed. Thank you, she said, the words coming out rougher than she intended. Don't thank me, Julian said, finally rising to his feet. Just let me keep doing better. That night, the penthouse settled into its usual late, sterile quiet. Ellie slept soundly for the first time in days. Clara, despite herself, allowed her guard to drop another inch. Lulled by the steady, rhythmic beep of the security system she could hear faintly through the walls. A small electronic heartbeat that meant the doors were locked, the windows were sealed. The world outside could not reach them. At midnight, the beeping stopped. Clara woke instantly, every nerve in her body suddenly, fully alert. The old trauma-trained reflex kicking in before her conscious mind even understood what had changed. She lay still in the dark, listening. The silence stretched on, heavy and wrong. And then, slow and deliberate, the door handle to Ellie's room began to turn. Clara was on her feet before the door fully opened, crossing the room on instinct alone, placing herself between the bed and whatever was coming through that door. It wasn't a person, it was a charge. Small and precisely placed against the lock mechanism, and it detonated with a force that turned the world into pure white noise. The breaching blast tore the door from its hinges and sent it crashing inward. The sound so loud it stripped away every other sense for one long, ringing moment. Clara's ears screamed with a high, piercing whine. Smoke and dust filled the room. Somewhere beneath the ringing, she could hear Ellie crying, a thin, terrified sound, and she lunged toward the bed on instinct, scooping the girl into her arms and pressing her face against her shoulder, shielding her eyes from whatever was happening. Figures moved through the smoke, armed, fast, professional. Julian appeared in the doorway a half-second later, weapon already drawn, his expression shifting from confusion to horror in the span of a single breath as he registered the breach. The smoke. The men flooding into a room that should have been impossible to reach. Clara, get down. He didn't wait to see if she'd heard him through the ringing in her ears. He moved fast and certain, crossing the room in 3 strides and throwing himself bodily between Clara and the first burst of gunfire that tore through the smoke. The impact staggered him. 2 rounds, high caliber, struck him square in the chest, the force of it driving the air from his lungs and sending him crashing backward onto the floor. Blood, dark and immediate, began spreading across his shirt. He choked, the sound wet and terrible, and tried to push himself upright. Tried to keep his body between the gunman and the woman and child he'd sworn to protect. But his arms wouldn't fully obey him anymore. Julian, Clara's voice cracked through the chaos, raw with horror. She had no time to go to him. A third figure stepped through the wreckage of the door, and Clara's stomach dropped at the sight of him. Dante. He wasn't surprised by the carnage around him. He wasn't horrified by Julian bleeding out on the floor. He simply crossed the room with cold efficiency, grabbed Clara by the hair, and drove a knee hard into her ribs, the force of it doubling her over and tearing Ellie from her weakened grip. The girl screamed, reaching for Clara even as Dante hauled her up and over his shoulder. already turning toward the hallway, towards the stairs that led up to the rooftop helipad. "You sold us," Clara gasped, struggling to her feet despite the agony in her ribs, despite her bandaged hands curling uselessly at her sides. "You sold a 4-year-old girl." "Business," Dante said simply, not even bothering to look back. "Crowley pays well for loose ends. The Vance name doesn't mean what it used to. Better to be on the winning side." He was gone before she could say anything else, his footsteps receding fast toward the stairwell, Ellie's screams fading with him into the smoke-filled dark. Clara turned back to Julian, and the sight of him stopped her heart cold. He lay on the carpet, the dark red stain beneath him spreading wider with every passing second, his breathing wet and shallow, his eyes struggling to focus. The carpet, once pale gray, was soaking through, the smell of copper thick in the smoky air. "Julian," she dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering, unsure where to even begin. "Julian, look at me. Stay with me." His eyes found hers, glassy and distant, but present, aware. "Ellie," he managed, the word costing him visibly. I know. I'm going to get her back, but I need you to stay alive first. Do you understand me? I need you to fight." Julian's hand twitched against the floor, reaching weakly toward the holster at his side, toward the pistol still tucked there. He fumbled it free with trembling fingers and pushed it across the carpet toward her, the metal sliding through the blood pooling beneath him. "Save her," he rasped. Then his eyes closed, his head tipping sideways against the floor, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven gasps that grew weaker with every passing second. Clara stared down at him for one frozen heartbeat, the gun cold against her bandaged palm, the rooftop somewhere above her, the sound of a helicopter's engine already beginning to whine to life through the broken window. She had a choice to make, and she had no time at all to make it. She grabbed the gun. Clara's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the pistol twice before she managed to steady herself. She knew triage. She knew the brutal, unforgiving math of trauma medicine, the kind that didn't care about feelings or fear, only about seconds and blood loss and the narrow window between life and death. And she knew. Looking at the spreading stain beneath Julian's body, the particular pallor of his skin, the way his breathing had gone shallow and fast, that his carotid artery had been nicked. He had minutes, maybe less. The gun in her hand could save Ellie, but Julian would be dead before she returned. She made the only choice that made any sense to the part of her that had once sworn an oath to save lives whenever she had the power to do so. She set the gun down on the carpet, dropped to her knees beside Julian, and pressed both bandaged hands directly against the wound at his neck, leaning her full weight into the pressure. He gasped, a thin, choked sound, his eyes fluttering open for just a moment. "No," he managed. "Ellie, I'm not leaving you to die," Clara said, her voice fierce despite the tears running freely down her face. "You don't get to make that choice for me." She had no tools, no clamps, no sutures, no proper dressing, nothing but her own body and the desperate, trained knowledge of exactly where to apply pressure and how much weight it would take to slow the bleeding enough to matter. She used everything she had, her hands, her forearms, the full weight of her body pressed down against the wound, every nerve ending in her damaged hands screaming in protest. Footsteps thundered into the room behind her, 2 of Dante's men, left behind to finish what the breach had started, raising their weapons toward the woman kneeling helpless and exposed on the floor. Clara didn't move. Couldn't move. If she lifted her hands even for a second, Julian would bleed out in front of her. One of the men grabbed a fistful of her hair and wrenched her head back. The other stomped down hard on her wrist, directly onto the bandaged, already damaged tissue beneath, grinding his boot heel against bone and broken nerve. Clara screamed, a raw animal sound torn straight from somewhere beneath conscious thought. The pain so total it whited out everything else for one terrible instant. She did not move her hands. He stomped again, harder this time, and she screamed again, tears streaming freely now, her vision swimming with white spots at the edges, every instinct in her body demanding she pull away, protect herself, end the agony any way she could. She held the pressure. "Let go," the man above her snarled, raising his boot a third time. "Let go, or I'll break every bone in that hand." "Then break them," Clara gasped, her voice shredded but unbending. I'm not letting go. The boot came down a third time, and the pain was so absolute that for one fractured moment, Clara's mind simply went white, blank, a held breath stretched past its limit. But beneath the white noise of agony, something steadier remained. The same iron core that had once thrown her own body over a child in the middle of a car bombing. The same refusal to yield that had carried her through 18 months of hiding, hunger, and fear. It was that same weight, that same body the world had mocked as clumsy and broken, that now held the only thing standing between Julian Vance and death, the thing she had been mocked for. The heaviness, the slowness, the body that didn't move like other people's bodies anymore, was the exact weapon keeping him alive. Gunfire erupted through the room, sudden and overwhelming, and Clara flinched instinctively, certain for one terrible second that this was the end. But the rounds weren't aimed at her, Julian's loyal men, finally breaching the floor after fighting their way up through the lobby, swept into the room and cut down the two stragglers in seconds, their bodies crumpling to the carpet beside the wreckage of the door. Get a medic. Someone shouted. Now, move. Move. Hands gently but firmly began easing Clara's grip away. Real medics now. Real equipment. Real clamps replacing the desperate pressure of her own ruined fingers. She allowed it only when she was certain, truly certain, that the bleeding had been brought under control, that Julian's pulse, weak but steady, fluttered beneath the new dressing being applied. She sat back on her heels, her hands a ruin of broken fingers and torn skin, blood, hers and his both, soaked into the fabric of her sleeves up to the elbow. Julian's eyes opened, hazy with pain and blood loss, but lucid enough to find her face. You stayed, he whispered. I told you, Clara said, her voice breaking despite herself. You don't get to make that choice for me. He reached weakly for her ruined hand, careful even in his pain, and she let him hold it. The two of them bound together in blood and exhaustion on a carpet that would never come clean. But above them, faint and growing fainter, the sound of helicopter rotors still spun against the night sky, carrying Ellie further away with every passing second. Clara looked up, toward the rooftop, toward the sound of a child she would not stop fighting for, no matter what it cost her next. She reached for the gun still resting on the carpet beside her. The stairwell to the roof felt endless, each step sending fresh waves of pain through Clara's battered hands and aching ribs. But she didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. Somewhere above her, a little girl was being carried toward a helicopter by a man who had sold her out for money. And every second Clara wasted on her own pain was a second closer to losing Ellie for good. She kicked the rooftop door open with her good leg, and the storm hit her full force. Rain lashed sideways across the rooftop, driven by wind that howled between the building's antennas and air conditioning units. The helicopter sat near the far edge, rotors already spinning, the noise a deafening roar that swallowed everything else. Dante stood near the open cabin door, Ellie clutched against his side, the girl's small fists beating uselessly against his arm as she screamed for Clara, the sound barely audible over the storm and the engine. Clara raised the pistol, rain running into her eyes, her ruined hands shaking so badly she had to brace her wrist with the other arm just to hold the weapon steady. Dante saw her and laughed, actually laughed, the sound carrying even over the wind, sharp with contempt. Look at you, he called out, not even bothering to reach for a weapon of his own, hands shaking like a leaf, half dead on your feet. And you think you're going to shoot me? You can barely hold that gun straight. Let her go. Clara shouted back, her voice raw, barely audible against the rotor wash. I don't think so. Dante shifted his grip on Ellie, using her small body as a shield without an ounce of hesitation, and gestured toward the helicopter's open cargo door. Step aside, or I drop her right now and let gravity finish the job. Your choice. Clara's finger trembled against the trigger guard. She had no clean shot, not with Ellie held so close. Not in this wind, not with hands this damaged. That was when she saw him. A second figure, slumped and barely conscious, sat bound in the helicopter's rear seat, burned along one side of his face and arm, blood crusted dark across a dozen visible wounds. But breathing. Alive, Marcus. Clara's heart lurched, disbelief crashing through her grief from earlier that night. He'd survived the collapse somehow. Pulled from the wreckage not by friends but by enemies. kept alive only because Crowley wanted the satisfaction of executing him properly, in front of an audience, as a message to anyone foolish enough to defy the family. Dante followed her gaze and smiled, cold and pleased with himself. Surprised. We dug him out before the building finished coming down. Crowley wants him breathing when he puts a bullet in his skull. Wants everyone to see what happens to men who get in his way. You're a coward, Clara said, the words shaking with fury now instead of fear. You sold out the man who trusted you. You sold out a child. And you're hiding behind her like she's a piece of furniture. I'm a survivor, Dante corrected, hauling Ellie a half step closer to the helicopter's open door. There's a difference. Sweetheart, even if your simple little maid brain can't quite grasp it, Clara steadied her stance, planting her bad leg as firmly as it would allow, rain streaming down her face, mixing with blood from a cut she didn't even remember getting. She thought of Julian, bleeding out 3 floors below, fighting for every breath because of the loyalty she'd given him. She thought of Marcus, who had thrown himself into a fire to save a child he barely knew, who had given everything and asked for nothing. She thought of every person who had ever told her that her body, her broken, slow, scarred body, was worth less because of what it could no longer do easily. She raised the gun. Every person has a right to live without fear, she shouted. The words tore somewhere deep and old inside her. A belief she'd carried through every hospital shift, every basement night, every moment she'd chosen to protect someone weaker instead of protecting herself. She didn't aim at Dante. She aimed at the helicopter's tail rotor, the one component that would ground the entire aircraft without risking the lives still tangled together near the cabin door. And she fired. The recoil jolted through her damaged hands like fire, but the shot found its mark, the tail rotor shattering in a burst of metal and sparks. The helicopter lurched violently, its balance destroyed. The pilot fighting uselessly against controls that no longer obeyed him. The aircraft spun, once, twice, the rotor wash whipping into a chaotic frenzy, and slammed sideways into the rooftop pad with a shriek of tearing metal. In the chaos, Dante's grip on Ellie loosened just enough. Marcus, bound and burned and barely conscious only moments before, found some final reserve of strength buried beneath the pain and the exhaustion and the simple, stubborn refusal to let this be how it ended. He lunged from his seat, his bound hands wrapping around Dante's torso with whatever strength remained in his ruined body. And together, they tumbled out through the wrecked cabin door. Marcus, no. Clara screamed, already running, already reaching. But it was too late. The 2 men hit the edge of the rooftop together, tangled in a desperate, furious grip, and went over the side. 60 stories of empty air swallowing them both in an instant of terrible, final silence. Clara's scream tore through the storm, raw with grief and horror, but she didn't stop moving. She reached the wreckage of the helicopter and pulled Ellie free from the twisted cabin, checking her over with frantic, trembling hands, finding nothing worse than scrapes and terror and the violent shaking of a child who had survived more in 4 years than most people survive in a lifetime. I've got you, Clara whispered, pulling Ellie close against her chest, shielding her from the rain and the wreckage and the sight of the rooftop's edge where 2 men had just vanished into the dark. I've got you. You're safe now, I promise. I've got you. Below them, through the broken cabin window, Clara could already hear the distant wail of approaching sirens. Vance loyalists finally securing the building floor by floor. The war that had consumed her entire world for 18 months finally beginning to end. She carried Ellie back toward the stairwell, every step costing her more than the last. But she didn't slow down, didn't stop. Not until she'd brought the girl back down to where Julian lay, pale and barely conscious, surrounded by medics fighting to keep him alive. Julian Vance spent 11 days in a private medical suite, hooked to machines that beeped in a rhythm so steady it almost felt mocking after everything that had happened on that rooftop. The bullet had missed anything irreparable by a margin so thin the surgeons called it luck. Clara, watching from a chair pulled close to his bedside, called it something else entirely. Stubbornness, maybe. Or the simple refusal to leave a 4-year-old girl without family twice in one lifetime. She visited every day, her own hands wrapped in fresh casts, 3 fingers broken beyond what a few weeks of healing could fix on their own. But she came anyway. Ellie's small hand clutched in hers, the two of them a fixture in the quiet hospital room that the staff eventually stopped questioning. Julian woke fully on the 4th day, weak and pale but lucid, his first words a hoarse, broken question about whether Ellie was safe, when Clara assured him she was. Sitting right there in the corner with a coloring book Clara had brought her. Something in his face crumpled with relief so total it looked almost like pain. He asked about Marcus on the 6th day. Clara told him the truth, plain and unflinching, the way she told everyone the truth now. Because she'd learned the hard way what happened when people tried to soften the world for each other instead of facing it honestly. Julian was quiet for a long time after that. Then he asked her to find out everything she could about Marcus Thorne, family, background, anyone left behind who deserved to know what he'd done and what it had cost him. It took her 3 weeks to find an elderly aunt in Worcester, the only family Marcus had left. Julian paid for the funeral himself, full honors, though he never once let his own name be attached to it publicly. Clara stood beside him at the small graveside service, the rain finally gone, replaced by a thin autumn sun that didn't quite reach the chill still settled deep in both their bones. He saved her life twice, Julian said quietly, staring at the simple headstone. Once from a car bomb, once from a helicopter, and almost nobody will ever know his name. We'll know it, Clara said. That has to be enough. Julian's recovery continued through the following months. Slower than he wanted, faster than the doctors expected. But the man who eventually returned to the Vance mansion was not entirely the same one who had left it. He moved differently, spoke differently, looked at the people around him, staff and soldiers alike, with an attention he'd never bothered to offer before. He dismantled the Crowley organization piece by piece, not through the bloody street war his father would have waged, but through something colder and more permanent. He used lawyers instead of gunmen, accountants instead of enforcers, slowly strangling Crowley's empire of its money and influence until the man who had hunted a 4-year-old girl across an entire city found himself with nothing left to hunt with at all. Crowley was indicted on charges that had been quietly building for years. Finally given teeth by resources, Julian funneled through channels nobody could trace back to him. It wasn't the kind of justice Julian's father would have recognized. It was, Julian was slowly beginning to understand, the only kind that actually meant something in the end. With the resources he'd once used to fund violence, he built something different, a foundation, modest at first, then growing steadily as word spread through the city's underbelly that there was somewhere safe to turn. Medical care for the families caught in the crossfire of gang violence, counseling for children who'd seen things no child should ever see, housing assistance for people who'd lost everything the way Clara once had, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but survival. He stood at a small press conference 6 months after the rooftop, his suit hanging slightly loose on a frame that hadn't fully recovered its old strength, and spoke without notes, without the careful, calculated phrasing his lawyers had prepared for him. "We cannot erase the violence that's already happened," he said, looking out at a small crowd of reporters who had spent years writing stories about the Vance Syndicate's brutality and were clearly unsure what to make of this version of the man standing in front of them. "I spent most of my life believing power meant the ability to make people afraid of you. I was wrong. True power is not domination. It is the ability to uplift the broken. We have a moral obligation to heal what we've helped break. And that obligation doesn't go away just because it's inconvenient or unprofitable." The reporters scribbled furiously, several of them clearly skeptical, and Julian didn't blame them for it. Trust wasn't something a single speech could earn back. He understood that now in a way he never had before. He returned to the Beacon Hill mansion that evening, the marble floors gleaming under the chandelier light, the staff moving quietly through halls that had finally stopped feeling quite so cold and sterile. He walked the length of the house out of habit more than purpose, the way he often did now, checking each room as if making sure the silence hadn't swallowed anyone whole. He stopped outside the small guest suite that had become, somewhere along the way, simply Clara's room. It was empty, not just unoccupied for the evening. empty in the way a room gets when someone has packed up everything they owned and left no trace behind. The bed was made with military precision. The closet stood open and bare. On the small writing desk by the window sat a single folded note, Clara's careful handwriting visible even from the doorway. Julian crossed the room slowly and picked it up. His hands not quite steady, he unfolded the paper. It was short. It thanked him for everything. For Ellie's safety. For the chance at a life neither of them had expected to survive into. It explained, gently but firmly, that Clara needed to find her own footing again, somewhere outside the shadow of his name and his money. Somewhere she could decide for herself who she wanted to be, now that survival alone was no longer the only thing demanding her attention. It did not say where she had gone. Julian sat down on the edge of the neatly made bed, the note still in his hand, and stared at the empty closet for a long time. The house was clean. The floors gleamed. Every room had been restored, repaired, made whole again after months of chaos and violence. But it was empty in a way it had never quite managed to be before Clara Miller had ever set foot inside it, dragging her bad leg across the marble, dropping a tray of crystal glasses that had somehow changed the entire course of his life. It took Julian 3 weeks to find her, and he only managed it because Ellie, now 5 years old and fiercely loyal to the woman who had once thrown herself over a car bomb to save her, kept a small drawing taped to her bedroom wall, a crooked little building with a red cross on the door. The words Clara's new job written underneath in careful, uneven crayon letters. A free clinic in the same neighborhood where Clara had once dragged herself through the rain to keep a child safe. Julian went alone. No suits, no bodyguards trailing 2 steps behind. No armored convoy idling at the curb. Just a man in a plain coat. Walking through streets he'd once only ever traveled with 3 armed men flanking him. His hands empty for the first time in longer than he could remember. The clinic was small, tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered storefront, its windows fogged with the warmth of bodies inside on a cold afternoon. Through the glass, Julian could see her. Clara stood behind a low counter, her casts long since removed, though her hands still moved with the slight, careful hesitation of someone learning to trust damaged tendons again. She was laughing at something a young mother across the counter had said, her whole face open in a way Julian had rarely seen in all the months he'd known her, lighter somehow. Freed of a weight she'd been carrying for years before he'd ever entered her life. He waited outside until the small crowd of patients had thinned, until she finally stepped out the front door to lock up for the evening, and only then did he step forward into the fading afternoon light. Clara stopped short at the sight of him, keys still in her hand, surprise flickering across her face before settling into something more guarded. Julian, Clara. A long moment passed between them, the street noise filling the silence. Neither quite sure how to begin after everything that had happened, everything that had been left unsaid in a folded note on an empty bed. Ellie's good, Julian said finally, because it seemed like the safest place to start. She talks about you every day, drew a picture of this place. That's how I found you. Clara's mouth twitched, something close to a smile. Of course she did. She misses you. I miss her too. Clara's voice softened, the guardedness easing slightly, more than I expected to. I think about her every single day, then come back. She shook her head before he'd even finished speaking, gentle but certain. Julian, I can't just be your maid again. I can't go back to a version of myself that existed only to clean up around the edges of your life. I'm not asking you to be my maid. Julian took a step closer, his hands still empty, still steady in a way that felt different than the careful control he used to wear like armor. I'm not asking you to be anyone's servant. I'm asking for something else entirely. Clara waited, watching him, the wariness in her eyes slowly giving way to something more curious. You taught me that dignity is inherent, Julian said, the words coming slower now, more careful. Like he'd practiced them 100 times and still wasn't certain he was getting them right. Not earned. Not something you hand out to people who prove themselves worthy first. Just inherent. In every person. Whether they're scrubbing floors or running a syndicate. You taught me that compassion is the ultimate strength, not weakness, not softness, but the hardest, bravest thing a person can choose. I don't want you as my savior. Clara, I never did. even when it felt that way. I want you as my equal, my partner. The keys in Clara's hand trembled slightly, though her face remained composed. Steady the way it always was when the moment called for steadiness. You're asking me to come back as what? Exactly, she said. Some kind of business partner. A title. I've already lost myself once trying to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. No, Julian said. I'm asking you to help me build the foundation properly. Not as a figurehead. Not as a name on a donor list. As someone who actually understands what the people we're trying to help have lived through. Because you've lived through it too. I'm asking you to run it alongside me. As my equal in every sense of the word. With my name carrying no more weight in that building than yours does. Clara studied him for a long moment, searching his face the way she'd searched it once in a rain-soaked alley. Looking for the lie. The angle. The catch. She didn't find one this time either. And if I say no, she said quietly, if I want to keep building this clinic on my own, separate from you, separate from the Vance name entirely, then I'll support that too, Julian said. And he meant it. The words coming easier than he expected. Whatever you choose. I'm not here to control your life. Clara, I spent too long thinking that's what power meant. I'm just here because I don't want to keep building any of it without you in it. In whatever way you'll allow. The street around them carried on, indifferent to the moment unfolding on the sidewalk. Cars passing, a bus hissing to a stop at the corner. Ordinary life continuing exactly as it always had. But between the two of them, something settled, quiet and certain, the way the last piece of a puzzle finally finds its place. Clara smiled, small and a little uncertain, but real. Her hands still shook faintly as she reached out to take his. The old nerve damage never fully healed and likely never to fully heal. A permanent reminder of the night she'd thrown herself over a stranger's body and changed the direction of both their lives forever. But her heart, for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt steady. Weeks later, on a bright autumn afternoon, Julian, Clara, and Ellie walked together through a public park not far from the clinic. The kind of ordinary Sunday neither of them had ever truly believed they'd get to have. No guards trailed behind them. No weapons rode hidden beneath their coats. No ghosts followed at their backs, waiting in the shadows for the next ambush. Ellie ran ahead toward the swings, her laughter bright and unguarded, the sound of a child who had finally, fully learned what it meant to feel safe. Clara watched her go, then glanced sideways at Julian, who was watching the same sight with an expression she'd never once seen on him during all those cold, sterile months in the mansion. Something soft. Something whole. A family, she said quietly, more to herself than to him, forged by mutual respect, Julian said, reaching for her hand, the rough, scarred texture of her palm fitting against his like it had always belonged there. And absolute equality. Clara laughed, the sound carrying easily on the warm afternoon air, and together they walked toward the swings. Toward the little girl calling out for them both, toward a life built not on blood and fear, but on something far harder won, and far more lasting. This story is designed as cinematic long-form entertainment and may contain exaggerated emotions, dramatic coincidences, or heightened tension to create a more engaging experience for viewers. Certain scenes have been intentionally intensified for storytelling and emotional impact. And so is Clara. Julian and little Ellie walked into a future no longer ruled by fear. This story leaves us with a truth that is both simple and powerful. The strongest people are not always the ones who stand tall, speak loudly, or command a room. Sometimes, the strongest person is the one limping quietly through pain, carrying wounds no one sees, and still choosing to protect someone else. Clara was mocked because of her body. She was dismissed because of her limp. She was treated like a servant, like someone invisible, like someone who had nothing valuable to offer. But in the end, it was Clara's courage, compassion, an unbreakable heart that saved everyone. She reminded Julian, and all of us, that dignity does not belong only to the rich, the powerful, or the beautiful. Dignity belongs to every human being. Julian Vance began this story as a man who believed power meant control. He had money, fear, weapons, and influence. But Clara showed him that true power is not the ability to destroy enemies. True power is the ability to protect the vulnerable, to admit when you were wrong, to change, and to use your strength to heal what the world has broken. This story teaches us not to judge people by what we see on the outside. Behind every tired face may be a battle we know nothing about. Behind every scar may be sacrifice. Behind every quiet person may be a hero who has already survived more than we could imagine. Clara did not save Julian because he was a mafia boss. She saved him because a life was in her hands, and she believed every life mattered. That is the heart of this story. Compassion is not weakness. Kindness is not weakness. Love is not weakness. Sometimes, they are the bravest weapons a person can carry. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: a family is not always built by blood. Sometimes, it is built by loyalty, sacrifice, respect, and the people who choose to stay when the world falls apart. Clara, Julian, Ellie, and Marcus were bound not by perfection, but by courage, by pain, by the choice to protect what was innocent, even when the cost was unbearable. So if this story touched your heart, remember Clara's lesson. Never underestimate someone simply because they look broken. Sometimes, the people the world calls weak are the very ones strong enough to save it.